Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for ShipIt number 13, Performance Testing at Shopify Scale. ShipIt is our monthly virtual gathering where we bring together engineering Shopify to talk about the things they're working on with all of you that decide to join us today. ShipIt was a way for us to connect with you in this digital world. My name is Anita Clark, and I'm the Senior Managing Editor at Shopify. I run the engineering blog. Today, we're talking about how we do performance testing at serious scale, according to my guest. Today's guest leads a platform conditioning team. He'll walk you through the scope of the problem, just what exactly we mean by platform conditioning, and what tools and techniques we use to execute tests at this scale. We're taking questions at the end of Chris's short presentation, so please use Q&A mode in the chat and we'll get to them shortly. And Chris, welcome to ShipIt, and we're glad to have you here. Thank you.
Hey, Anita. Thank you. Thanks for the intro there. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Thanks for taking the time out of your day. I know that the world's going through some stuff right now, and I appreciate everybody who's tuning in, and glad that you're interested in learning more about performance testing and what we do at Shopify. Let's just kick this off. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a few things, and I'll start by giving you an overview of flash selling on Shopify. We'll go over through some basic terminology and concepts of what we do on the platform conditioning team. We'll introduce some science, of course, because you can't have a great presentation without some science. And then, as Anita mentioned, we'll have Q&A at the end of this. Before we dive in, I'll just give you a quick introduction about myself. My name is Chris, of course, and I lead the platform conditioning team here at Shopify. Our team is really focused on making the spiky events of Shopify, those selling events that appear out of the blue, more regular, more common, and making teams better conditioned because of them. So I'd like to start by just showing you a picture of Shopify. This is any given day at Shopify. We have a nice, beautiful scene here, some rolling hills, predictable traffic, things are going well. This is what we consider baseline at Shopify. Every now and then, however, we see something that looks like this. And this is a storm out on the horizon already coming our way. And of course, what I mean by this is a spiky sales event. We see these at Shopify often appear out of the blue, unannounced. And we've developed a platform where merchants are able to sign up and direct as much traffic as they'd like to our platform. So in practice, what this looks like, often we'll see merchants selling streetwear, shoes, sneakers. These are common kind of flash selling products. And our merchants like to sell these when we have the dynamics of a desirable product like this, and maybe limited quantity, maybe some resale value that's extremely high. We then see a flash sale. We see a lot of buyers arrive at Shopify looking to purchase this product, and they all come at once, usually because of either a social media post or maybe a celebrity who's shared some information about an upcoming drop. This is what we see internally when a flash sale happens. I actually took this example from our Datadog dashboards recently. This is in the last couple of weeks where we had a flash sale. And this is from our app servers. So this is app server traffic. The different colors are different components of Shopify. And you can see within a minute or two, our overall traffic on app servers doubles. It's twice as high. And this traffic is directed at a single shop on Shopify. So you can understand when this happens, if we weren't prepared, if we weren't conditioned for it, we could be in big trouble. So my team, the platform conditioning team, we like to simulate this. And here's an example of simulated synthetic traffic that we've thrown to Shopify to try and simulate a very similar event in a very similar time window. And again, you'll see the different components of Shopify. This is app server traffic. This is not cached traffic. This is hitting our app servers. Some other examples of this shared by our CTO, JML. The one on the left here is a load balancer request per minute. And just to give you a little bit of an insight here, this was right before Black Friday. This was the week of Black Friday, which is, for those of you that don't know, Shopify's biggest selling season for our merchants. And the different colored lines, you can't even really see them on this slide, but this is overall platform requests per minute. The big blue wedge in the middle is traffic that we threw, requests that we generated using performance testing, load testing, stress testing, making sure that all of our systems were in place. On the right here, you'll also see a traffic shape. And shaping is something that we also concentrate on because real organic traffic doesn't have a nice kind of rate limited shape. It comes in a big spike usually and then has a long tail on the other side. So that's an example of one of the shapes that we've generated. So I know that many of you have tuned in today to find out how we do this at Shopify. And I'll tell you, I apologize in advance. I reviewed my slides this morning and looked at them, and I realized there's a lot of boxes and labels and lines. So bear with me. I'll try to do my best to explain. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to explain everything up and build upon it. So the basic building blocks of performance testing is load generation. What do we mean by load? You'll notice also that I have included a lot of body conditioning analogies throughout the slides. This is because we've pulled a lot of analogies on our team from what we do as humans to condition our own bodies to be better prepared for unexpected events. So load, as we like to think about it, are requests. We offer a SaaS platform. Requests generate load. Every request that hits Shopify carries a different weight, like a computational weight or expense or cost. And we might have a request that hits a cached endpoint, very lightweight, but we also might have a request that comes in, let's say, to checkout, very expensive and very computationally expensive. So different requests have different weights, and we try to take all of those into consideration when doing our performance testing. We stitch together a few requests, and we call that a flow. You can think of that as a recipe. If you're creating, baking something, you might have steps in your recipe. That's what our flows are. So typically these will be a series of requests in order that are issued against Shopify, and we refer to that as a flow. I'll show you an example of what that looks like as we write them internally. So we use Lua as a programming language. This is a very lightweight, easy to learn programming language for our load testing scripts or our flows. And here's an example of one of these scripts. So we start by including some helpers, some common libraries. We've also included a platform conditioning library here, which gives us some standardized functionality. And then we have a function that's called do steps. And this is, again, like I said, like with a recipe, you perform a series of steps. Many of our flows are related to simulating an actual buyer going through Shopify. And this is how we do simulations. So we start with some storefront setup. This is standardized storefront setup. And then our simulated user will visit the homepage. At this point, a request would be made to a shop's homepage. We have some interesting functionality at Shopify where a storefront can actually be protected from the public by a password, and our load tests can bypass that by checking for password, entering that password, and then proceeding through with the load test. Another thing that we like to do is test with and without certain features. Here we are using customer accounts, and a customer that is logged into a shop is going to have slightly elevated computational weight or cost than a guest visitor, someone who's not logged in. In this specific flow, we browse product catalog, we add some things to cart, and finally, we create a checkout. So the checkout actually has multiple steps at Shopify. We input some random customer information to make sure that we're not hitting any cached endpoints. We pick a shipping method, we pay, and then finally, we poll on a processing page. So this is an asynchronous response that we're waiting for the server. And in a browser, it would be the user wouldn't know this is happening, but in a flow, when we write it out like this, we'll have to do some polling. So that's all kind of encapsulated in a flow. So here we have a flow, and we've written it in Lua. And if we execute that flow, then it will run against Shopify. Of course, if we scale this up many times using an orchestrator, then what we end up with is a load test. You can think of this as multiple executions happening. I've drawn 3 here. In reality, we do this many, many times, sometimes in the millions of executions. As I mentioned, our flows are written in Lua, and those actually run within a VM, a Lua VM written in Go. And so in this diagram, I've changed this out to workers. These are worker instances of our load generator written in Go, and the overall orchestrator or scheduler is also written in Go at Shopify. Taking all those boxes together in this idea of being able to generate load, we have load generation, which of course enables us the ability to load test. So in theory, we should be ready for load testing, but unfortunately, that's not quite good enough. And I'm just putting this slide in here because for years, we had the ability, and many teams have the ability to generate load, but we have to be a bit more opinionated about what we do with that load. And just checking off a checkbox as you build product to say, yep, I've done my load test, carry on, let's deploy this product, let's release it, is not quite good enough. And we need to evolve, our merchants evolve, our platform evolves, and this has to be something continuous. So introducing science, I promised that there would be some science in here. And starting off with the ability to load test, obviously we can test repeatedly, which is a good part of the scientific method, but there's more to it than that. And here's a high-level overview of the scientific method. This might be a refresher for a lot of you. Let's start on the left side. We state our hypothesis. So this is a hypothesis that we generate before an experiment, and this is what we expect to observe during our experimentation, during our tests. And we state this clearly for everybody to know, but then also to refer back to later on. Then we enter into the experiment. We test that multiple times, test it repeatedly, and we observe. We mark down our observations. We record those for our future selves, but also for other teams at Shopify. Finally, based on those observations, we draw conclusions and we relate those back to the original hypothesis. Okay, I actually put this slide in here this morning. This is just time to decompress because I'm going to rewind back to where I was before, but it's also a good reminder for me to take a breath. Back in. We left off at this slide, load tests, load generation. We have that already, but we want to apply this. We want to apply the scientific method to it. So we start with a hypothesis. And this can be anything. Obviously, we're pretty optimistic about what we build at Shopify. So often our hypotheses will be a statement of something positive. We expect everything will go smoothly at the end of our experiment. We then design our experiment, and our experiment will contain possibly one, possibly multiple load tests. These are because we can change values, we can change variables as we test from one thing to another as part of our experiment, all relating to our hypothesis. Finally, based on the observations that we have through our experimentation, we draw our conclusion and we relate that back to the hypothesis. Sometimes we've proven the hypothesis to be true. Other times we've observed something that maybe is proving our hypothesis to be false, in which case this becomes an iterative cycle and we'll go back and we'll create future experiments of the same thing. It's all fine and good. I know that this is pretty boring stuff. So let's talk about this. Does it include a lot of overhead at Shopify? Maybe, but it's also worth it. And I say, we need a formalized process around this for consistency across teams, but also we rely heavily on what our developers before us have done, what they've experimented with, what they've written as flows. And so having a reusable framework that we have in place for load testing, load experimentation becomes really important for us as a company as we grow, as we bring on more developers and develop more tools. Luckily, we've made this overhead really easily internally, and we've built out a tool to help developers through this. This is called, we've actually named it Chronogram. And what we do in Chronogram, this is a Rails app that we've built on top of our load generation tool. And we use this as a framework for experimentation through performance testing. So here, again, I'm just going to kind of fly through some of this and leave questions at the end for Q&A. But here we'll see we're designing a new experiment. We've given it a name. We've given it a hypothesis. In this case, we want 25 of sessions to use buyer accounts, and our standard flash sale levels are sustained with no observed problems. We also have the ability to reuse some of our previous load generation scripts. So I'm just going to try this feature here. Down below here, we've included what is an orchestration, and this is referring back to the load generation. This refers over to a config file that we use to generate the load through the Lua scripts that I was talking about before. Another important part of what we do is ensuring that we have a shop that represents what an actual merchant shop would look like. So we've developed some tools internally to make sure that we have coverage in our test shops that we use for performance testing. So we have this radar chart here with a number of attributes that we can configure. And this shows you, for instance, number of customers, number of product variants, number of orders that exist on a shop. And then we can overlay actual merchant shops on top of this same chart to show, do we have coverage with our test shop or not? And we always try to represent best what our merchants are using. Once our experiment's designed, we head over to Slack. And Slack is our tool of choice for chat ops, and everything that we do from an experiment perspective is done through Slack. This gives us visibility across the company for any team to be able to see the experiment that's happening. It also helps our IMOC, our incident management on-call teams, to be able to respond if they see something happening in the wild and they want to know if a load experiment's happening at the time. So we use Slack for starting experiments, stopping experiments. We can initiate the individual load tests. We can generate more load. We can use Slack to record our observations. So any comments that are shared in Slack get attached automatically to the ongoing experiment that we're running. We use it for overall communication between teams as well. Finally, we watch dashboards pretty much continuously, almost always have dashboards up on our screen to both watch our production infrastructure, but to see what's happening behind the scenes with load generation. So on the screen, we can see how many executions are kicking off. Each execution, if you remember, has a number of steps, a number of requests that are made to our platform. So those will come back through the number of HTTP requests. After the experiment is complete, we log this and we attach it to the experiment that we generated in step one. And over time, as we rerun these experiments, we will see trends. Often we see if an experiment went bad. In the second row on this diagram here, you'll see a little alert that notified us that something really bad happened. Down below, you'll also see the average response time was recorded. The last one there is 16 seconds long. So again, maybe not a high number of errors, but our average response time during that experiment was quite high. So something to look into. This is particularly useful for some of the automated runs that we've set up through our load generation. And then finally, a few details here. We tap into some external systems. This actually pulls in from Datadog monitors and alerts. Any alerts that happen within the window of an experiment run get attached or annotated onto that experiment so that we can look into them again afterwards and have that record without anybody having to do anything. So the overhead of that observation is taken care of automatically by our tooling internally. Here we see load cheddar kicked in when we were running this experiment. There was a high number of 500 series errors. We had error codes that were, or error responses that were abnormally high. And these are very important for us to look at and to consider. Finally, I like to include this picture in some of my slides. We are building a platform that has many different components. And if you think of a sports car being built, every component of this sports car needs to be independently tested for its own specifications. The wheels, the tires, the brakes, even the windshield or the fasteners throughout the car need to have their own tested specifications before they're all strapped together and taken for a test drive. So our reliance on teams to do their own independent testing makes it even more important when we strap everything together and do end-to-end testing across Shopify platform. Speaking of doing continuous testing end-to-end, we actually schedule many tests throughout the day, and we do these daily, recurring, again, building the muscles of Shopify as we develop product, as we build on our platform. And this ties back into, this is my last slide, platform conditioning and the spirit of platform conditioning across the company in general. The more that we make spiky traffic bursts a regular thing, the stronger our teams get. These kind of micro stresses help the overall kind of compound movements of Shopify and the overall strength of Shopify as a platform. So that is a brief overview of how we do things, but I'm excited to jump into Q&A and find out if I can answer any more questions that any of you may have on the live stream. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. So we're going to start off with our first question. Do teams do load testing in a separate environment from your production traffic?
Oh, that's a great question. No, in fact, we don't. And we certainly have the ability to. We can direct our load at any endpoint really on the web, but we typically point these at our production environment in all cases. So again, I'll kind of use that race car analogy. When we release product at Shopify, it will often be behind a beta flag or feature flag, and we can direct traffic at that. We can include people in whatever beta is being rolled out. And we can also make that exception for our generated synthetic load. And so when we release product and it's behind a beta flag, very similar to kind of what I was talking about before with the password protection as well, we can test that live in production against our production environment. And I think the important thing to recognize is we keep talking about simulation, and simulation is our way of getting as close as possible to what we observe with real buying behavior on Shopify. And the best way to do that is to get as close as possible to what an actual user or visitor or buyer would experience when they are going through a Shopify store and completing a checkout. So we encourage that for sure. And we've embraced it as a company to be able to test these types of things in production. I'll also just kind of like give a few more details on that. We do have certain shops that we've set up for the purposes of load testing. And those, though they exist in production, are not receiving actual buyer traffic. They're not receiving real organic traffic coming through. We don't target our merchant shops directly with any load testing. Obviously, it's not really kind to our merchants, but we do try to represent as closely as possible any merchant or any environment that our merchant would create and simulate it through there.
Great, thank you. How do you assure your load generation should not hit cache?
So, great question. We do hit cache. We want to hit cache, and it's not uncommon for a caching mechanism to go down or to become overwhelmed. So, we almost treat our load generation as I was about to say that we almost treat it as dumb. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't really have knowledge of the internals of Shopify. We generate load to simulate users or buyers or API clients that don't know or care about the internals of Shopify. So if they happen to hit a cached endpoint, we want to see that, and we want to make sure that all of our caching mechanisms are going to stand up to that traffic. Now there is, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at with your question, but we do have the ability to bypass our caching mechanisms when needed to understand what stresses would hit the underlying platform in the case that one of these mechanisms became overwhelmed or was non-existent for whatever reason. And the specifics of that I can't really share, but you can. It is at our shop level that we do that. So, like I mentioned, we have specific shops that are meant for load testing, and they exist in production environments. and we can configure those shops to have caches turned on or turned off as we do our load testing. And that helps us to stress a greater amount of our underlying infrastructure, our data stores, our app servers, those types of things, because we do want to cover those situations. But for the most part, we actually drive traffic, and we just drive it even higher to be able to overwhelm caches. I gave that example earlier of customer accounts being turned on. Often customer accounts will bypass any kind of front-end caching that is available because they are logged into their own personal customer account. And that's one mechanism that we use to kind of like bust the cache.
Great. Our next question is interesting. I hope you have an answer for this. I'm not even sure because you're not necessarily in marketing, but the question is, how does our platform conditioning specifically tie in with Shopify's marketing as a whole? As a whole is a paraphrase, sorry, but yeah.
Yeah, I can do my best to answer this question. So if I'm going to buy a product, or if I'm going to pay any money for anything, I want to know that it's put through the ringer and it's well tested, and that it will withstand my needs as a customer of that product. And so if we consider Shopify platform to be the thing that our merchants rely on and have the confidence in when they're choosing a platform to handle their business, to allow them to sell, to fulfill their needs, they need that confidence. And one of the kind of ways that we do that is through platform conditioning and giving, talks like this, but certainly giving feedback about how big we've tested, our throughput that we can handle, the number of requests that we've observed. This is all part of platform conditioning, the strength that we've developed internally to be able to share that externally, as well as merchants are looking for a good solution. So I think that kind of goes hand in hand with marketing, although it's a second order effect of that. We don't actually do platform conditioning for the purposes of marketing, but it certainly reinforces our ability to kind of like tout how big we've gone as a platform.
Great, thanks for that. Quite nimble on your toes there.
Maybe I should be in marketing.
Yeah, maybe. Next career. This doesn't work out. How do you make your testing environment as close to as possible with the production environment?
Yeah. Again, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but let me go into a little bit further detail. So first and foremost, we start with a representative shop, and our merchants. So Shopify powers over 1.7 million merchants' businesses currently, and each one of those businesses or shops comes in a different shape or size. There are shops that sell a single product and they sell it really well. There are shops that sell tens of thousands of products on Shopify. Some shops have like a small group of customers that have recurring subscriptions. Other ones have very millions of customers that have bought product over the years. So it's very important to us, first and foremost, that we get the shop dimensions correct. And this is the term that we use internally. Shop dimensions can refer to that radar chart that I showed, where we want to make sure that our representative shop exists in production that has the same shape and size as one of our merchant shops. The second thing that we do is look for theme features that exist on those shops. A theme is what is applied, the front end that is applied over top of a shop to allow merchants to brand the shop however they want. This is great, good and bad. Obviously, it gives merchants the freedom to do whatever they'd like. And theme developers and partners work with these merchants to be able to apply this skin and make it their own. However, it also gives them the freedom to introduce new API calls or hidden features in those themes that can actually apply additional stress to our platform when buyers are visiting the site, especially under load, like a flash sale or during Black Friday, Cyber Monday. These are things that we want to expose ahead of time. So we will often either clone a theme, or we will look through that theme to find code blocks that we could replicate in our test themes. And then once those shops exist and they have a theme that is appropriate, we then try to replicate the traffic shape. Because this all exists already in production, the traffic shape becomes the next most important thing. So think of traffic shape as not only the flow of requests that are made by a single execution, but the rate at which traffic appears on storefront. A great example is on Black Friday, Cyber Monday. That is, like I've mentioned, for our merchants, the biggest selling weekend of the year. And we'll actually see a very steady, slow ramp up of traffic as people sign on to their computers in the morning. They're looking for good deals across the net. We see a steady increase in traffic. This to kind of like counterbalance that. When we compare it to a flash sale, often a flash sale is announced sometimes just moments in advance, but sometimes built up on social media for a very specific time, a very specific drop point. And this traffic appears in a huge surge, a big thundering herd, and that traffic shape will spike and then typically tail out. And this, again, is a way that we represent as close as possible to our production traffic when we're simulating this internally using some like our performance testing.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, next question. Do you happen to do any observability tools, techniques to analyze performance?
We do. And I'm not personally an expert on some of our observability tools. We look at a lot of this internally. Again, the teams that are responsible for certain components of Shopify will have those tools available and they'll know what to look for. So we do have, for instance, tracing that exists on our flows that we can dig into any single execution that happened. I mentioned before, some of these executions, we will execute a flow sometimes millions of times in a few minutes. And we can dig in. These are typically sampled because we're not capturing every single execution, but then we can find out where were the bottlenecks on that flow. Was I stuck in polling? Was I stuck in like a checkout throttle or checkout queue as a user in that execution? But then we can dig into, every team can dig into the underlying kind of profiling of the different queries that are being made, the caching mechanisms there, what's holding things up. And we hope that teams will take that on themselves. From our perspective in platform conditioning, we have a high level understanding of the majority of components at Shopify, but we leave that depth, that kind of like deep knowledge of what's happening on the individual components up to those teams because they're best suited to kind of handle those things. From our own perspective, we do look for things that we would consider bad experience, either for an API client or a buyer or a user that's coming through, or even a merchant in their admin. If it's taking a long time to load an internal admin page while the site is under load, that's bad experience. And so this is kind of like where we draw our concerns, and then we'll typically work with the teams to iron out, the details of what's going on here, what queries are being hammered or slow, and then work with those teams to generate further experiments on top of their fixes. So if we found, hey, there's a slow query here, and especially under load, it's really kind of bringing things down, the team may go off and fix it, and then we'll rerun some of the experiments on top of that.
Awesome. Okay, our next question is the performance testing team, and that's performance conditioning team here at Shopify, the same as the scaling team? Can you speak to the overlap and coordination between performance testing and scaling?
I'm trying to think of like if we have like a team for scaling specifically. We certainly have like production engineering that will work at scale. It's not the same team from my perspective. I hope that people don't consider us a scaling team, but we do think about scale, and we do work hand in hand with teams that are thinking about scale. And I'll give you an example. As we head into Black Friday, Cyber Monday, every year, this is by far our biggest event, and we actually scale the entire platform up to be able to withstand all of the buyers that will come through, all of the buying traffic that will come through. And part of this, we actually do exercises well in advance sometimes as early as May of the same year, where we go through a scaling exercise to scale up all of Shopify, to increase the replica count, to make sure that our entire infrastructure is ready for that Black Friday traffic. And then our team works hand in hand with the teams that are actually performing this scaling to ensure that when we drive load, or when that load appears at Shopify, that we are successful throughout the event. And we do this across, so we have a podded infrastructure where you can think of pods as kind of like data store shards across Shopify. We actually will hammer all of the pods collectively all at once across several regions through our performance testing as we scaled. We also have other exercises that we participate with these teams in, for instance, kind of like regional evacuations or failovers, to make sure that even under load and even under the worst circumstances, we will still be up and still be running during those events.
Our next question is asking if we have a Discord channel, and unfortunately, currently we don't. I don't believe there are any Shopify Discord channels across the company right now, but who knows? Keep an eye out. Maybe that'll be something we think of.
What is the best way? I mean, if people have questions post today, what is the best way to kind of ask them? Because I would love to answer some of these questions even beyond this webinar.
Oh, that's very lovely. You can plug your Twitter account. You can like
Shopify Eng, right?
Yeah, you can also bother me on Shopify Eng. But I'll just end up passing them off to Chris. So you probably should just bug him directly. But either way, our Twitter account, or Chris Inch's Twitter account, you can get a hold of us. Or, I send an email out when this event is done to everyone on the registration list. You can also reply to that email, and we'll pass on the questions and get them back to you as we can. You're so lovely for people. No one's ever asked that here. Okay, our next question. How low level in the stack do you guys monitor? Is it just general CPU, memory, and IO? Or do you do more complex analysis like EBFP?
No, I mean, from my team's perspective, we would stop at memory, CPU. Going lower level than that, there are probably people at Shopify that do, but it often doesn't cross my plate or our plate on our team. So, and like I mentioned before, we actually try to keep it fairly high level from our perspective, and only dig in really when there are problems. And these often, when we're running some of these experiments, we might run something and not even this started out. So let me rewind a bit. A couple examples. We used to run some of these experiments and wipe our hands clean and be like, wow, that was great, and we'd kind of walk off stage, and then we'd get pinged by somebody on Slack being like, was somebody running a load test during this time window? And we're like, oh, why? What happened? And then we'd find out afterward that we had some impact somewhere else on the platform, completely unexpected, because of some downstream effect. And so this is one of the reasons that we introduced some of the Datadog monitor alerting notifications being logged onto experiments automatically, is because we wanted to start having those exposed in our face. Or for us as a team, is a good thing because we have lots of context. But even worse is when somebody comes in with little context and doesn't know that they're causing downstream effects, whether CPU spiking or something like that. So having that kind of in your face as an experiment runner is important for us and important for everybody to kind of understand.
Our next question is, do you do load testing separately on the application by itself and the application and the infrastructure together to identify the problem separately?
So I'm not exactly clear what is being referred to as the application in this case, unless we're talking about partner applications. So I'll just kind of make an assumption. If you want to chat or clarify, that would be good. But two scenarios. One is we have our core product, our core platform, and this we refer to as Shopify because this is where the code base where everybody is writing parts of Shopify. And then there's all sorts of extensions on top of that. These are services or apps that are used by our merchants. And these are first-party apps that we've developed internally, and they actually kind of like make up the entire platform that a merchant would experience. And we test all of it, and we try to stress all of that as we go through our different experiments. And we're constantly making new experiments to test new paths as things are being developed. We encourage teams to do the same, and then kind of add it to our library of end-to-end tests. The other interpretation of what maybe you mean by apps are third-party apps, and I'm gonna talk a minute about this because it's important to understand. Because we are a platform and we enable anyone to build apps on top of Shopify, those apps could actually be in the hot path for what might be, a critical part of the buyer journey as a buyer goes through storefront into checkout. And our partners build on top of Shopify, and we currently don't stress our partners through any of our performance testing. So we actually manually kind of like exclude those requests if we were doing an end-to-end test. This is important because it's not fair if you're, maybe many of you are partners out there who are building on top of Shopify. I don't think that you would like it if on some random afternoon we started to slam your infrastructure with requests coming from our performance tooling. And that's not to say that that's the way it will always be, but currently any app that is built on top of Shopify, we kind of expect at this point that they're doing their own performance testing before kind of like bringing it into Shopify.
Great, thanks. Next question is, do the load testing experiments go all the way through a purchase payment gateway?
Again, so yes, but not a third-party payment gateway. So Stripe, for example, there is the ability to test Stripe in test mode, but they will quickly rate limit us if we were to send real transaction or like simulated transactions through that. So we actually have internally developed benchmark gateways that we can kind of throttle back if needed. We can inject errors if needed. And we use those benchmark gateways for testing purposes. So we do go end to end all the way through a checkout, but it's in an internally developed gateway that will take that payment to give us some sort of feedback on whether, there's a bottleneck there or not. And then it also kind of takes the order all the way through to order completion on the other side of that, which again is part of this, the whole experience. We want to make sure that when we are generating the traffic, we don't just stop because that's not, again, simulating real buyer behavior. There's a lot of downstream stuff that happens even after a user clicks checkout and they receive their kind of like checkout complete page. We have to adjust inventory. We have to, write the order, send emails, all sorts of things that happens downstream from this. And these are often queued up and we have to work those off. And those queues can become overwhelmed as well. So we have to kind of like keep our eyes on all of it as we're moving through the process.
Awesome. Okay, next question is, do you do anything to dry up test writing for teams, performance tests versus your end-to-end tests? And there's a reference to Cypress, which I'm assuming is some kind of tool.
I'm not familiar with Cypress, but we currently don't have a lot of mechanisms in place to dry up our tests. It is actually something that we are currently working on, because I think what you're getting at, and it's very kind of astute of you, is developers might not like this aspect of development, doing performance testing. Some do, obviously. I wouldn't have a team if they didn't. But we want to make it as lightweight as possible, and we want to leverage what former developers have done and contributed already. So I'll speak honestly. Over the years, before we kind of started paying real close attention to it, many teams would go in and duplicate logic over and over to kind of accomplish their needs, and then kind of duck back into their team. And this went on for a long time as we were doing load generation without a formal experimentation framework around it. So this is getting better, and will get better over time, where we'll actually, we're exploring right now being able to test our load tests or load generation through unit testing and stuff, being able to confidently reuse or modify code that other developers have contributed through our load generation. So kind of like it's on our list of things that we are concerned about, but currently don't have a lot of ways of enforcing that, I guess, or drying it up to a point where people can just quickly grab what they need.
Great. Our next question is, you mentioned that you have shops for testing. In regards to the life cycle of every request, do you persist this data? And how do you deal with retention of such a massive load?
Yeah, it's the same as production traffic. So we don't have any different separate policies in place for data retention on our load test shops. Everything that's logged goes through kind of the same pipeline and is available for us to kind of look at afterward. We do have retention policies on logging and Datadog and some other things there, but all of these orders that we are generating are written to a database and are persisted there. So we don't typically go back and clean any of these out. And again, it's just in the spirit of having that real representation of what our merchants are seeing and what our merchants are experiencing. So we don't want to add that as like an artificial process that we include in part of our performance testing. And honestly speaking, it's probably cheap for us to keep it around. So that's what we do.
How do you make sure that the test merchant is similarly bulky in terms of data as a real merchant?
Yeah, good question. And I'll just try to be as transparent as possible. So we'll look at a merchant's shop. We've kind of identified some of the larger merchants on the platform, and we can look through the shop and then you count how many rows they have for products or product variants or meta fields or customers or orders, and then we'll generate a new shop. And we'll generate artificial data, sometimes using like a faker library or something like that, and just pump that into the shop using our APIs so that shop becomes bulky in the same dimensions of the merchant that we care about. Some merchants, like I said, do like high volume traffic events, but they have very few actual customers or products on their shop. So it's just the sheer number of orders that we're seeing and being able to write those orders. Other ones are kind of like steady state, high volume merchants that have a ton of customers, a ton of products. And we have shops that kind of represent those. On our team, we've developed what we like archetypes for these merchants. And we have shops that represent different kind of shapes and sizes of merchants that we start from now as like starting points. At the beginning, we didn't have these, so we kind of created them from scratch. But now that these archetypes exist, and there's probably, I would say, a dozen or so different rough shape archetypes that we can use as starting points, and then move those over, try to replicate those in the same way for a different shop that we can then hit with traffic.
What do you see as low-hanging fruit for us out there in smaller engineering teams?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessary to go into like developing your own tooling. We do it internally at Shopify because we're kind of tightly integrated with our process and our ability to scale. We actually looked into a few third-party tools, I'll say, for load testing, for performance testing, before kind of rolling our own, and decided that even just our throughput that we wanted to achieve was not achievable through, and I'm not going to name any names, but through some of the tests that we did. Of particular interest to us was actually like simulating users using headless browsers. That was kind of like a path that we followed for for a little while because, what better way to simulate a user than to fire up a browser and have that browser navigate the site rather than writing flows that would do it and issue the raw requests for them. And that just, it was almost a non-starter because the scale that we need to be able to test for an event like Black Friday, or even just a massive flash sale event, we can't do with headless browsers. But sorry, getting back to your question, low-hanging fruit, start with any tool and start driving that load. And all good products kind of start in a spreadsheet. So if you're going to be recording your experiments time after time, just record them as rows in a spreadsheet and then share that across your organization so that everybody can see. And look for certain metrics that you care about, whether it's response time or error rate, and record those in a row in your spreadsheet, and then start to share that out and track whether you're getting better or worse over time. Increase the size of your load testing, your performance testing. And I think that's probably the easiest way to get started, and then scale up from there as you and the company grow. I think that's probably the best step forward. I wouldn't waste, half a year writing your own load testing framework, because there are plenty of great ones out there.
I was going to ask if you have any recommendations for people. Obviously, we're not using tools here because you guys build them, but what are some that you think are great out there?
No, I
know it's really hard because I
would just search for your needs, and see what other people are using, and start with that. Really, they're all very similar, right? We're all just driving requests at an endpoint. Reusability is important for sure. Ease of use is important. Being able to kind of share them between teams and encourage other teams to use them so that it's not just one team. I will make this kind of plug right now for platform conditioning is early on when we formed the team, we said we're not going to be the team that everybody just throws their work over the fence to us and then we go and load test it. We actually took the stance of let's empower every team across Shopify to be able to do their own load testing and make it really, really easy and almost fun to do. And make it kind of like a culture of performance testing built into how we build product at Shopify. So again, if you're just starting out in this area, don't form a team whose sole responsibility it is to do load testing for your company, for your application. Make it a culture and make that as part of your development process. This is part of becoming stronger and releasing great software. So that's a good approach.
We have a question about your favorite metrics to monitor for.
I've already mentioned them a couple of times, but I actually
know what to get you for your birthday.
Yeah, any 500 series errors, great to that. So there's kind of an inside joke, and maybe this is I can kind of tell some stories here as we kind of finish up, but we've really embraced our ability to cause havoc on the platform internally in our team. And it's almost something we become really proud of. And more than that, our leadership across Shopify celebrates when, for instance, that we've had an impact that has caused people to sweat across teams. When, people are getting paged and they're on call and they have to respond because we've created an incident using synthetic traffic. This is something that we celebrate, and nobody comes to, shake a stick at us or hit us with a stick if we've caused some damage, because that makes us stronger from that point forward. And the more that we do it and the more that we celebrate it, the stronger we become. So the story that I wanted to finish with was about a year and a half ago, I was working with a team. We were running a pretty regular stress test, and the difference between a load test and a stress test, generally speaking, is load tests have a known kind of threshold that we try to meet, and then we check off the checkbox. A stress test is when we push load to a point where things start to break. Anyway, I was working with the team and actually had to run out for a separate meeting, and I came back to find out how the stress test went. And I could just tell by the look on people's faces around our pod that, the blood had kind of drained out as we had caused a little bit too much damage. But we celebrated it and made that as like a thing that was to be, it was an accomplishment. And it's actually become harder and harder to have that type of impact at Shopify because of the performance testing and because of platform conditioning and becoming stronger as a company at building product. So
the last question is, how frequently do we do data cleanup against load generation?
Yeah, never really. So we leave it out there. Even the shops that we've generated for the specifics of load testing, like we don't ever go through and delete those. It can create noise, but it's okay. So I would either kind of like flag it or have it in a spot. Luckily, we have shops, and those are kind of like our nicely encapsulated objects that we can throw load at. And so we can ignore specific shops. If we're filtering out data, we can kind of like ignore those shops. But whatever you're working on, I would look for that element that you can say, okay, this is where all of my synthetic data is going to be associated, and then filter that out from your reporting. Obviously, at Shopify, that becomes super important when we're looking at something like GMV calculations, when we're calculating how much money has actually been transacted through and on Shopify as a platform. And for sure, we have to filter out any of this artificial synthetic data that we've generated. And we have mechanisms to do that internally, but build that into your process as well. Try to find that element that you can hook your load data onto without the need to constantly purge it, because I think that there's added benefit to kind of having it stick around or being able to look at it later on.
Great. Thank you. This was really awesome, Chris. Thanks for joining us. It's always fun chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime. There'll be a video of this event posted on the engineering blog, and I'll also be sending out an email to everyone who registered for our event. We're hiring 2021 engineers in 2021. So head to our career page and see any open roles. Do you have anything to plug here? You got open roles there?
There's lots of great roles at Shopify. Come check us out. If you have any questions, we're all a friendly bunch as well. So ping us or ping Shopify Eng, and we'll find the right spot to direct your questions. But I mean, if you ever want to chat or have questions, just reach out to anybody at Shopify. We're all friendly.
That's lovely of you to say. Finally, I want to thank everyone that's come and spent this hour with us. We're touched by how many of you joined. We loved all the questions. It was a really great discussion. And I hope we've given you some things to think about for performance testing at your own company. In the email, there'll be a survey. We want to know what you want to see, how we can make this thing better, and be here for our next event. It's actually a week earlier than the end of the month. It's on May 19th, and we're talking about React Native. So if you're interested in React Native, this is the event to come, and you can ask questions about some folks from our team that can help you out there. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you're joining us from. And we really appreciate everything.
Thanks. You, Anita. And thanks to everybody who tuned in.
Have a good day.